everyone. I'm very, very excited to be introducing Giovanni Colavizza today, who is Associate Professor of Computer Science at the University of Bologna and the CTO and co-founder of Odoma LLC in Switzerland. He was Assistant Professor of Digital Humanities at the University of Amsterdam and Senior Data Scientist at the Alan Turing Institute. And he's going to say more about his background when he starts to speak. And yeah, welcome everyone to this, to what promises to be a very exciting talk. We'll be recording this talk, but we'll stop the recording for the Q&A. So over to you, Giovanni. Thanks again.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. Could you please confirm that you can hear me well and see the presentation? Always yes. Good. Okay, fantastic. So I'll go then. I'll start. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Barbara, and the people at King's and everybody for the invitation and everybody for attending. I'm delighted to participate to this seminar series, and I'm also sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I would have wanted to, but perhaps another time. This one, I really couldn't make it. So I'm going to talk about using AI, artificial intelligence technologies to broaden access to historical archives. And let's see, okay, just to quickly complement what Barbara mentioned about what I'm doing at the moment. Only what I'm doing at the moment. I just joined the University of Bologna, going back to Italy after many, many years abroad. And my remit here in Bologna will be to teach and do research primarily on machine learning applications for the arts and humanities. We'll notice that I'm moving from AI to machine learning here. We could discuss that later, maybe in the Q&A. So that's the primary focus of my work here. I'll also be teaching at this master degree, 2-year master degree that we have called Digital Humanities and Digital Knowledge, which is essentially a 2-year program in computer science meant for students that come from any bachelor in the arts and humanities. So I find it very, very interesting because it aims to really give both skill sets and perspective to the students. And then finally, I think there is a return. Someone maybe have the microphone on. I'll try to keep going. If whoever it is could please mute themselves. Thank you. So the third aspect of my work that I shall mention, because it's becoming increasingly relevant, is technology transfer or commercialization, if you like. So supporting organizations, primarily public organizations, but also companies with applying machine learning to, again, primarily processing and extracting information and enriching their digitized digital collections. So that's a bit the set of things, and happy to talk more about them later on. Now, just to set the scene, I like to start with this kind of gallery of AI advances that we have been witnessing in the past few years. And you see here many, many different things, right? And I don't know about you, right? Well, the key point that I would like to make is the following: that what I thought many years ago, or a few years ago, when I started to get into machine learning applications, is that I was expecting a lot to happen in applications such as those that you see on the left-hand side of this gallery, right? So autonomous driving vehicles, manufacturing, robotics, and things like that. I mean, that is all happening, but it is not happening at the speed and pace that many people would have expected a few years ago. Instead, what we are seeing is many advances, really groundbreaking advances in areas that have much more to do with creativity, with knowledge, with creating contents, with solving really challenging intellectual and scientific questions. Right? So examples here have to do with generative AI, for example, which is really going to boom in the coming years to create any kind of content automatically or semi-automatically. Language understanding and the use of chatbots, conversational agents to have a conversation and really explore a topic, for example, in new ways. Protein folding, so solving scientific, long-lasting scientific problems with AI, or even playing very complex video games such as AlphaGo. So many things are happening in this space that is not, let's say, too physical. It's instead much more intellectual, creative, related to knowledge, and therefore I would say much more relatable and directly connected to what we do in the arts and humanities. And indeed, I would say, just very broadly speaking, that there are at least three big AI advances that are relevant to the humanities. We could discuss about the name, but it's more important about the kind of key idea behind them. I would say that the first is anything that has to do with information processing, information extraction, what we can do to automate, or augment painstakingly difficult tasks that we used to do manually in the past, such as, for example, transcription of historical sources. The second point that I mentioned is generative content creation. I think anything that has to do with creating new content, or using an AI to create new content, or conversing with an AI to create new content is directly related to many domains in the humanities, not to mention education, of course. And thirdly, what I call here high-risk applications. So I'm borrowing here, of course, from the EU AI Act draft legislation that we will see if it goes through or not, but which has introduced this concept of high-risk applications. So anything that uses AI that impacts a social or a cultural context that is with the possibility of creating unwanted consequences. And of course, the humanities, but also the social sciences do study that, right? Do study culture, do study society, and therefore have direct understanding of these high-risk applications and should be involved in their discussion. So a lot is happening, a lot more is going to happen. And that I think is very exciting, very promising, and it's going to be also very challenging, and calls us from the humanities directly into the game. Now, in terms of the overview of this talk, I'd like to talk, let's say, about three things picked from recent work that I've been doing with different colleagues and collaborators, and finally say something about what I think are interesting future trends to look for in the near future, or at least that I hope they will develop in that direction. So the first one, AI and historical archives. Now I'm going into more our business proper. And here, what we have done now a year and a half ago is a survey paper. We wanted to understand, colleagues at the University of Amsterdam, what is happening at the moment and has happened in the past, let's say, few years at the intersection between archives and AI from a research and application perspective. And so we went through a lot of literature, and we tried to systematize it. And I'd like to just highlight a few of the key findings that we have found. First of all, as you may imagine, I guess, there is a lot of work in the direction of automating archival processes. I'm talking about things such as transcription, but also indexation, also supporting search, classification of files, for example. But at the same time, this work is really very fragmented. It's very difficult to find, for example, technical work that uses the very same data so that it is comparable in terms of results. It is also very difficult to access data to begin with. Right? So many archives contain contents that are not fully known. So they might contain sensitive content, it might contain personal data. So it's difficult to disclose them for research and applications. So that leads to a certain fragmentation in terms of these advances, and perhaps the domain where things are increasingly coalescing around at least some tools is that of transcription, automatic transcription. But there is a long way to go, I would say. Another point that we found is that consistently attention when we start using AI in historical archives emerges with respect to the traditional way archives are organized and used, right? That, for example, of the original ordering, so the respect of the physical and logical organization of an archive in order to access it. Now, when we use AI, we start to extract information and we start to be able to do full text search, keyword search, etc. Then we fundamentally shift the way we can use the archive from aggregate of records, right, that need to be accessed as such, to data, essentially, right? And then we can go directly to pick specific documents, specific contents, easily losing track of the context. So that is a tension that is emerging and hasn't been solved yet. Thirdly, development that I'm particularly excited about is that from the very machine learning community, let's say a certain understanding of the importance of knowing what goes into the training data and the evaluation data has been emerging since a few years now. So people have realized that, you know, maybe there are unwanted consequences in just throwing everything that you have at your algorithm, and instead it would be perhaps, at least for certain applications, it would be better to have a clear understanding of what is in the training data, including biases, including omissions, including anything that might create distortions in the use of the model after training. So in production, so to say. And in order to do that, something extremely important is the proper documentation of a data set that is meant for machine learning application. And of course, there are some principles that come from the archival community that could very well be applied in this sense. I'm talking about things such as provenance, appraisal, so a certain curatorial intervention, contextualization through metadata, transparency in terms of, again, what is in the training data to begin with. And these are becoming known words, let's say, in the machine learning community, not very quickly, mostly through practice, the practice, for example, of documenting data sets and models. And I'll come back to that later to discuss another paper. So this is something I think very, very important, that it is happening, should happen even more explicitly. And finally, I mean, not finally, because there is much more in the paper, but finally for, as a digest, executive summary, so to say, we also have a very big question that is open and I think is significant obstacle in the use of AI in the context of historical archives, but archives more broadly, I would say, which is the lack of trust, perceived lack of trust, right? So there is often a barrier in terms of understanding at least two things. So how well a certain model is behaving, or more often, how when a result is good enough, right? So when can we say, I don't know, when we are transcribing automatically an archive, for example, that we have a sufficiently good recognition quality for whatever application we have in mind. And that's complicated to answer because it really depends on the application. And then secondly, more generally, a fundamental question about what these models can and have learned through training. And so the intuition, but also technical desire, let's say, to make sure that the model has learned something appropriate, right? So has learned appropriate packets in the data, has learned motivated connections between the inputs and the outputs. And how to do that, how to convey this trust into AI technique is very much an open question. And again, I'll come back to that later because it is going to be very important in the context of forthcoming regulation around AI applications. So this is a little bit what is happening with AI and historical archives. I think it's a domain where there are many opportunities really to contribute, and I hope I have distilled also, open questions, opportunities that you can easily see how they go much beyond historical archives, right? So through that application, they could reach a result, could impact many other domains and applications where AI is used. Okay, second example from recent work, still historical archives, specifically colonial archives in this case. We have worked with other colleagues on, let's say, a challenge that often appears and materializes with archives in general, colonial archives more specifically. And it has been very eloquently being introduced by Michel Roth-Trouillot with the book Silencing the Past, which is a specific discussion around the Haitian Revolution, but making very much more general points about colonial archives. And this mechanism of silencing the past, according to the author, that can happen in several steps in the, let's say, the history of an archive, from the creation of facts, so to say, so from when something that has happened is being recorded in a document that then becomes a record, down to how the archive is used, let's say, presently, for example, by historians, in order to write history, right, to produce history. And in between those two moments, there are other moments whereby silencing acts, either willingly or unconsciously, can happen. For example, they can happen because part of the archive is lost. But it can also happen because there are some biases or certain perspective that the organization or the persons creating the archive to begin with have. Or they may happen at the end because there are certain interests or perspective that a historian is going to put into using the archive and the narrative created from it. So silencing is something very significant. It can happen in many ways, and one particular way that we wanted to work on with this project has to do with silencing acts that can happen when archivists work on indexing a certain historical archive and making it available for the community of reference. Now, when that happens, choices are made, right, in the creation of the so-called finding aids, for example, indices. And those choices then have an impact on how people can use the archive to begin with. And this is very much the situation that we have found in a very important archive in the Netherlands, which is that of the Dutch East India Company, VOC. Specifically, we have worked on the archive of testaments, so wills made by usually sailors in the East, so usually in Jakarta, Batavia back then, that were then copied and sent back to Amsterdam for being archived. And during the 19th century, the archivists, in order to make these records more available, they created alphabetical indexes using the name of the testator as an entry in an index, right? So, of course, this is something, but this is also very, very limited, because you can imagine that in these testaments, we have all sorts of people that are mentioned. Other people, relatives, for example, other people with whom there is a certain connection for the purpose of the will, but also people that go without even a name, right? Unnamed people, for example, that happens often in the case of slaves. Places, and a lot of other information that can be relevant. Instead, the only thing that we have is the name of the testator at the moment, which is very limiting. So what we thought is that, well, can we use machine learning in order to expand the coverage of these finding aids, and in particular using a technique that is very standard, let's say, in machine learning, a task that is called name entity recognition, or in our case, I would say just entity recognition, because again, we were interested in both named and unnamed mentions of people, but also places. So, fortunately enough, this is not unique, but not a very recurring situation either. We not only had the full archive digitized, but also fully transcribed with Transcribus, which is an application to do handwriting text recognition. So we could directly work on the texts, which were deemed from an evaluation campaign to be of sufficient quality for this task. And then what we did is the following. So first of all, we had to design a so-called ontology of personhood, right? So we could not just use a standard set of categories that are used in name entity recognition, so person, place, organization, for example. But we wanted to expand them, and in particular to add attributes to be closer to the source and to be able to extract as much information as possible about any person, named or unnamed, that was mentioned in these records. And so you see an example here, for example, of so-called qualifiers, two mentions of persons, evidently, that have to do with their so-called legal status from considering the status of being a slave or not. Secondly, we ran an annotation campaign, creating a corpus of high quality of about 7,000 annotations. And this serves for us as sort of way to propose a so-called shared task. Right? So publishing this data, including baselines, so models that are relatively good at this task, that have been trained and offer a starting point for the community to engage with the entity recognition task, to reuse this data set and hopefully reach results that are good enough for then the archive to expand the coverage of the finding aids that they have. We are also working on this, of course, ourselves, and we will see in the future whether we actually manage to go in that direction. But here we move from, let's say, prototype research outcome way of involving the community to attempting to put something in production again, right? So that needs to go through the proper screening and assessment of the archive, of course. So that's going to take a longer time, but hopefully in the future we'll get there. Something interesting and worth mentioning, I think, is that as we worked on this project, and we are still working on this project, other things come up, right? So opportunities, let's say, challenges and opportunities, I like to see them put together. A challenge is in this specific archive is that colonial archives are increasingly used by let's call them non-specialists, so users that do not necessarily have training in history, in archival science, and that do not necessarily are very knowledgeable about the context of production of these records, and therefore able to search through them and understand them as an expert would. Instead, a lot of public-facing interest is increasingly happening for these archives in particular, and that poses a challenge, right? Because on the one hand, that is really good, and the archive would like to support this engagement. On the one hand, on the other hand, there is a barrier, right? There is an issue with respect to how to access those records, and one of those barriers is that of offensive language or terminology and language that is found in those records, that was used back in the day, but would be considered offensive nowadays. Now, the challenge here is not only that someone might be offended by this language, but also that they might even think about using such a language in order to search through the records. So an idea in order to solve that we're just experimenting on is that of so-called lexicon expansion. So given a term that is occurring in the records that is considered nowadays to be offensive, can we expand it? Can we offer alternatives that are non-offensive that would still lead to a match to that specific record mentioning this terminology to begin with? And as you can imagine here, again, the technology is much less complicated than the actual challenge and problem, how to do it, and how eventually to include it in an interface. But again, I think very, very important application, very interesting application. Then that's it's worthwhile to work on. And finally, for this paper, I mentioned before the growing importance, recognized importance of documenting data and models in the machine learning community. So with this paper, we also try to be as exemplary as we could in that respect. So we created what I think is very thorough so-called data card. So piece of documentation here, you just see the first page that describes in detail this data set, so the annotations that we have created, its intended purpose, how it was created, by whom, with which goal in mind, and anything that it's in our opinion important to consider when potentially using this data set for other applications or the same application. And this practice, I think, is very, very important, including considering this documentation as a living document. I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so this is another, let's say, example application that I find very exciting because it really connects us with challenging questions that are at the moment being faced by archivists in many countries, and whereby AI can perhaps help, at least. Third example has to do directly with this topic of documenting data and documenting models, but here I'll primarily talk about data sets. So with several colleagues recently, we have published a paper on the Journal of Open Humanities Data called Datasheets for Digital Cultural Heritage Datasets. Now, what's the deal? So we started from the point of view that, or the assertion, motivated assertion, that cultural heritage, digital cultural heritage in particular, which includes born digital and digitized, has some specific characteristics that it's worth to keep in mind when documenting it as a data set for machine learning use. And this directly connects to the point that I made before on the importance of documentation, and perhaps also the importance of considering other approaches, not just grab everything, put it in a cauldron, and then train a model using that, but also let's say forms of data collection that are more interventionist, so to say. This is a diagram taken from a paper by Ge and Gebru, Lessons from Archives, which is very, very worthwhile and makes this point very compellingly, trying to sketch two, let's say, polar opposites with respect to data collection. One is very laissez-faire, very much just collecting whatever. And the other one is very interventionist. Of course, in archives, in libraries, in our domain, we are more used to it, right? So we are more used to an expert curatorial intervention. And then there are compromises in between. So an important point is that a lot of what is happening in machine learning is very much on the left, right? And maybe it's worthwhile to work a little bit to move, rebalance, at least for some data sets, this perspective to some more intervention, or at least awareness of what is in the data. So of course, work on this is happening. There have been a few papers proposing different ways to document data sets for machine learning. This is another one called data cards that I like quite a bit because it's not as popular as other papers, but I think it has a better design. So I keep mentioning it because it's very modular and it is very adaptable to different settings. But be it as it may, this is a bit the important topic that we wanted to intervene on. Asking ourselves the question, how should these data sheets or data cards look like for digital cultural heritage data sets? And as I mentioned before, we started from making some, let's say, motivated assumptions. What is specific to digital cultural heritage that is important to consider when documenting such collections for machine learning use? And here there are a few points that I think are particularly important that we elaborate on in the paper. The first one is that given the logic of, let's say, interventionism that we have in many of these collections, these are already curated, right, to some extent, or at the very least, they often are not coming to us in full, but there are gaps, there are many things to consider, and therefore it's very, very important that we have it clear with respect to the provenance, criticism of the source, so what is actually in the source and why, and selection tool criticism. Right? So we need to be clear about how the source has been selected as went through any form of curatorial intervention. Secondly, this object can be very mutable and dynamic. I mean, this applies also to, of course, to contemporary data sets, but here the idea is that also our knowledge about those objects can change over time. And how to represent that and how to keep the data sheet or documentation connected with that changing knowledge about an object is, again, an open question, a challenge. Thirdly, we have a lot of heterogeneity. Collections can be, for example, multimodal. They can include text, they can include images, they can include many different things. Fourthly, it's very important to have contextualization, right? Because I mentioned before that there is a logic in terms of metadating and documenting that is interventionist. At the same time, usually what we want from archival collections and other related collections is to provide everything as is to the user, adding context, adding metadata, adding information about the object. And of course, that requires context, right? That requires us that we don't lose that context that has been provided by experts or scholars about the very object that we then will use for machine learning. And finally, yeah, I mean, it's the intent for the production of this collection is often very, very different from, what we have in mind nowadays, and very often different from whatever modern day applications we might have in mind. So it's quite important to keep that in mind and not, maybe perhaps not use cultural heritage data very liberally for modern day applications. So those are our starting points, and then how do they impact the creation of a data sheet? So documentation for digital cultural heritage data set that is meant for usage in machine learning applications. Again, many different points that we have. We also created a model data card, a proposal for a model data card that embeds them. That goes with the paper. So if you're interested to look it up. And I just wanted here to sketch a few of them. I won't go through them all, but I just want to mention maybe 2 or 3 that I think will be particularly interesting to you. So one is that, in our opinion, it is very important, item 3 here, is very important to detail how digitization has influenced the data set. So often in digital cultural heritage datasets, we have a process. Right? So we have a process from digitization to maybe information extraction, such as text recognition, et cetera, that leads to the dataset as we have it for machine learning use. So we need to be very explicit about it. We need to be very explicit about the evaluation at every step, how it was conducted, and eventually what are the limitations that are included in those steps. Secondly, fourth item there, and a little bit, what I have tried to showcase with the previous paper that I have discussed, we think it's very, very important that these datasets are released with benchmarks for machine learning. So what does it mean? It means that they should include some attempt to use them for machine learning applications, for a task, for example, including an evaluation. And that should serve as a way to invite reuse in that direction. Because one of the big limitations that we have in AI applications, in archives and more broadly in cultural heritage, is the difficulty of comparing results. So everybody uses different data sets, sometimes not available. So it's very difficult to compare, right? So very difficult to say what works better or worse. And hence the importance of setting a benchmark together with the datasheet. And finally, so not finally, but just the final point that I'll make, the importance of these machine learning datasets and datasheets to become gradually but steadily part of active collection management. So active collection management means responsibility of, let's say, archivists in context of an archive, not only to work on the inventory, to work on all the archival management, let's say, tasks that they have, but also to keep up the curation and maintenance of datasets and datasheets for machine learning as part of collection management. Unfortunately, all too often we see this attempt to release some data with some documentation, but they are left there. They are no longer updated. They are no longer worked on, and that's a bit of a pity. Okay, that's the third paper that I wanted to discuss. Now I'll go to conclusions. So what I personally think are interesting directions to work on next. I'll propose a few and then eager to know what you think about them. Now, speaking specifically about historical archives, I think there are several opportunities there. Some I mentioned. So one is definitely open data, open models. So releasing more with proper documentation, more benchmarks. That really is important to advance applications. Secondly, I think information extraction is really a key domain of application here. And in particular, when we deal with multiple modalities, as I mentioned before. So I think it will be important to keep working on all these different tasks that we have in information extraction pipelines for historical archives, but also to bring them to production, right? So this is a bit why I added robust there. So there are many prototypes. Again, it's and I'm guilty of that to some extent as well. It's one thing to try something out. It's another thing to make it into something usable and adopted by archives. And I think that step is missing at the moment. This is why, incidentally, I'm also active in technology transfer and commercialization, because I think that's one way to go there, not the only one. So I think that, working more on that critical step is very important going forward. Thirdly, generative AI. How can it be used to, again, broaden access to historical archives, right? So an example are conversational agents. So that could provide a very interesting mean to access historical archives that can be very complex. Of course, that's really not easy to develop. And finally, transparency. So how to have transparent workflows, linking back to that issue of trust that I mentioned at the beginning. it's important to agree on how to document, for example, data that has been produced by AI in the context of archival workflows. And then perhaps using techniques, let's say from explainable AI, to provide a necessary clarity in terms of how a certain machine decision has been made. So these are a few ideas. Happy to collaborate on any of these if you're interested. And then I'll just finish with a little bit more speculative ideas. So I mentioned at the beginning these three big areas, AI advances that are directly connected to the remits of the humanities: so information extraction, creative content creation, generative AI, and high-risk applications. So I'd like to say a couple of words more on the last two here that I haven't really discussed during the talk. Now, I mentioned before that there is maybe a forthcoming EU AI Act, which will attempt to regulate AI applications in the European Union, and might serve as exemplar to other countries. Now we could discuss this at length. Maybe we can in the Q&A, but the important thing is that there is a classification of systems that is proposed that includes limited risk and high risk applications, which entail a growing set of responsibilities and regulations that kick in when we are developing and using, say, a high risk application or limited risk. And these include really things that I've been mentioning, but that we don't really know how to do technically yet. For example, dataset transparency requirements, right? So what does it mean for a dataset to be transparent, transparently documented? How do we audit this system? What kind of information should we put in a log? Who is going to look at the audit, and how do they act? How can we document and even find out if there is problematic data that is being used for training? For example, containing personal data or proprietary copyrighted content. So all these, how do we document AI decisions to begin with? So all these are very big questions that I think will require a lot of work to be eventually translated from law to practice in an acceptable way. And where I really think there is an opportunity, because if we look at historical archives, well, it seems to me that that's an excellent playground to start asking ourselves these kind of big questions. And indeed, one big idea, so to say, that I like to propose is, can historical archives actually be a sort of petri dish to find out how to deal with these high-risk applications in a much more broader sense, right? Because we do have pretty much the same challenges, but it's a relatively safer, yet still very demanding setting to use AI. So why not take it as an opportunity, to go in the direction of answering these big questions? And secondly, I think personally that solving these big questions will go through also a very important shift in perspective. At the moment, all AI is really about automation, but I think there is an untapped potential in going the direction of augmentation. So, which is quite a bit happening now with conversational agents such as ChatGPT. So entering the logic of a dialogue between an agent and a human instead of just automating a task away. And I think that is much more interesting for applications in the arts and humanities, in historical archives, and also it will be one way to answer positively to eventually forthcoming regulation around these applications. And that's all from me. I hope it wasn't too long, and I'm eager to discuss and answer any question, if I may. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. This was really brilliant overview. I'm going to stop the recording and open the Q&A.